Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. Can everybody hear me in the back? I always need to do a sound check with people in the back. Can you hear me in the back now? All right. My voice does not go much higher than that, but I'm Tyler Giannini. I'm going to be moderating the discussion today. I co-direct the International Human Rights Clinic, and we'll be talking about Myanmar today. I personally have been working on these issues for a very, very long time. I was actually in law school the first time I went to Myanmar, and that was 1994. So more than 20 years at this point, the first time I stepped into the country. Most of those years have been working on accountability issues. That is going to be the focus of our discussion today, and we have a great group of individuals. I'm going to go through those briefly. Just a bit on what the clinic does, because it's also relevant and will be part of the discussion. So we've done a lot of work on Myanmar in the last 10 years, more than that at this point, and in a number of ways. The most recent work we have done has been specifically around accountability. And it was a joint project of mine and Matt Buer and Susan Farbstein, who may or may not be in the room. She co-directed the clinic with me. And it was based on a 4-year investigation into possible violations, international crimes that were taking place potentially around one offensive in 2005 to 2008. Dozens of students took part in that, and it led to a conclusion that we found that there was sufficient evidence to meet the international standards related to international crimes, related to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and specifically related to officers who were commanding that offensive. One of those officers was General Kokko. He is now the current Home Affairs Minister of the country, and his name will come up later in discussions today as well. So that's one of the most recent things that we've done. One of the things that I would just highlight is how personal these kind of investigations become, and we're going to hear some personal stories. Some of the things that I remember from talking with people about that offensive from 2005 to 2008 was the severity of and the widespread nature. Every person that we spoke to had some account of how the offensive had impacted their lives. We looked at one particular district. Every village, literally every village where we talked to someone from, had some effect from that offensive. The entire swath of the area was affected. Another thing that keeps sticking with me are stories like this, where individuals would say that they would leave not because someone was killed or because artillery was lobbed into their village, but because in this offensive they left their village and they took rice stores with them for maybe 4 weeks or 5 weeks. But because the offensive lasted for so long, they couldn't go back to their rice stores. They were essentially starved out. That's what caused them to flee. And these personal individual stories are very important in discussions about accountability. And so I think with that, I'm going to get to who are we talking to today. We're talking to Roger Normand, who's the head of Justice Trust. Please identify yourself. Here he is. I'm going to keep introductions very short. Matt Smith, who has founded a group called Fortify Rights. They're going to tell you more about their work, so I'm not going to do that. And then 2 individuals from Burma. Right here is Aung Thein, who is a lawyer from Myanmar. And Yi, who's next to him, is going to be translating, but we're not going to translate everything for him. He's going to talk about some of the work that's being done, including a landmark case that's been brought recently. And then we have the Skype up because there's Teikkha Nyana, who is going to join us as soon as I finish this quick introduction. And he is a monk from Myanmar. He was originally planning to be here, but he became ill in New York, and so he wasn't able to travel. But he was gracious enough to join us by Skype. So he is going to start the discussion and tell us more about his own personal accounts surrounding one particular incident in northern Myanmar. Roger's going to give you a few minutes on that, and then Teikkha Nyana will talk about his own experience. So thank you, and please join me in welcoming everyone who's going to speak today.
Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of background about what happened, which is linked to the case that Justice Trust is helping bring with the lawyers and monks. Lepidong is now a name known throughout Myanmar. It's a joint venture copper mine between the largest Burmese military holding company called Upang or Umel and Norinco, Wanbao, which is a subsidiary of a very large Chinese state-owned company, military company, very powerful. You had a demonstration in which not only hundreds of villagers, but hundreds of monks joined to protest this development, because the development was also destroying sacred sites, sacred Buddhist sites. What's notable about this case, because it's a case like hundreds of other land grabs across the country where whenever villagers sit on valuable land, they're just moved out by military interests, no compensation, no rights. What's notable about this case is that because it's such a huge case, so important to the military company, they used white phosphorus munitions to disperse the protesters, which led to horrific injuries, because white phosphorus is a chemical weapon, and they used it after fire hoses were used against the prisoners, which turned it from a very dangerous weapon to an extremely dangerous weapon. It changes to phosphoric acid. So I visited Teikkha Nyana in the hospital in Bangkok. He had been rushed there because his life was in danger. There were more than 100 monks, very severely injured. I visited the hospitals. It was really a horrific scene. And I think that sent a message to the country, and that was the purpose of that. Let me leave it at that, and I think we can now hear from Teikkha Nyana, who he'll describe what actually happened.
Okay. အရှင်ပြားရေကျမတို့ခုနက intro လေးနည်းနည်းတူတူလေးပေးပြီးပြီအရှင်ပြားတို့တွေဖြစ်ပျက်မှုကိုနည်းနည်းပြောပြပါတော့လက်ပတောင်းကြောင့် Roger လည်းနည်းနည်းပြောပြီးဒါပေမဲ့အရှင်ပြားနာကျင်တဲ့ကိစ္စနဲ့ဒီကကျောင်းသားတွေကိုပြောပြပါ Harvard ကကျောင်းသားတွေကို
အဲ့ပြတော့ကြား
ရတယ်အရှင်ပြား
အဲ့တော့ပြောမှာနော်တို့ဗမာပြည်ထဲမှာတို့ဘုန်းကြီးတွေကအာဏာရှင်အစိုးရတွေကိုဆန္ဒပြတယ်နော်
There are different groups of monks in this country. Most of us the group that I belong to are the monks who are protesting and who oppose the military control over our lands.
တို့ကတဲ့အာဏာရှင်အစိုးရကိုအေးချမ်းညံ့လက်နဲ့မကိုင်ပဲနဲ့ဆန္ဒပြတယ်
We oppose them in peaceful means without weapons. We use our words simply to speak up against them. We've simply tried to articulate what it is that we want. But unfortunately, our peaceful protests are met with might. They crush us brutally, using force. At the 6 protest campsites that we had at Lepidong, there was over 300 monks that were involved in the peaceful protests. They came, they doused us all with fire trucks full of water. It was extremely cold that night because of the water. We all had blankets and our robes. We made a decision not to retaliate or fight back or anything. We just kept our heads down, covered ourselves up with robes and blankets, and bear the brunt of it. shortly after they threw incendiary weapons or fire bombs at us.
တို့ရဲ့သင်္ကန်းတွေတို့ရဲ့ဒီထုံတယ်တွေကိုရွှဲနေနေတာကိုအဲ့ဒီမိလာပုံနဲ့ပြတော့ဝုန်းနဲ့ထတော့တယ်
My robes and my blankets that were soaking wet all of a sudden caught on fire. Everything was aflame.
တို့တကူလုံးကိုမိလောင်သွား
My entire body was burned.
တို့ရဲ့အထက်အောက်ညာရှင်းတော့အကုန်လုံးမိဆွဲလောင်သွားတယ်
I looked to the front, to the back, above, below me, all around my sides. Everything was on fire.
ငါတကူလုံးကိုအကုန်လုံးမိတွေပဲသွမ်းချွန်လာတယ်
I was engulfed in flames myself.
တော့ငါညီဘောကိုလှိမ့်ပြလိုက်တယ်
I dropped to the ground and I rolled to try and put the fire out.
မိလောင်အားနေသွားမလားအောင်းမိပြီးတော့ထုတ်လိုက်
I hoped to extinguish the flame. It was very painful.
ဒါပေမဲ့မိကဆက်လောင်လာပဲဖြစ်တယ်
There was something about this specific fire and this bomb that it was very hard to put out the fire on my body.
ဒါမှငါမိတွေကထွက်သွားလိုက်တယ်
But eventually I walked out, I rolled to the ground, and I was able to leave.
အဲ့နောက်ငါချစ်တော်မူကြားတဲ့ကိုနောက်တော့လောက်ဘုံထပ်ကြ
Just when I thought I had made it to safety, I realized another canister exploded right between my two legs.
ငါချစ်တော်နဲ့ပါဆိုတော့ကိုလုံးမိလောင်ကုန်တယ်
So my whole body now is on fire, including my legs and my lower limbs.
မိလောင်တန်ရာကသိပ်ပြင်းထန်တယ်
It was very painful, and it was very the flames were very strong and hard to put out.
ဒီတော့တွေကနာကျင်ကြိုက်ခဲကုန်တယ်
I suffered tremendously.
ငါမှဖဏလည်းမပါတော့ဘူး
I had no shoes. I was walking away trying to run.
ပြီးတော့အဲ့ဒီနေရာရက်တီကမြေပြင်ကကြမ်းတမ်းနေ
There was so much gravel and the road was uneven and unpaved, so it was a struggle to walk out, but I had to leave.
အောက်ကတောက်ခဲတွေစူးညောင်ကလုံးနဲ့ပြေးရှာနေတယ်
I remember the pieces of gravel and rock cutting into my feet, and as I tried to make my escape.
အဲ့ဒီပေါ်မှာဖဏမပါတဲ့ဗလာချီတောက်နဲ့ငါလမ်းလျှောက်ခဲ့ရတယ်
But I managed to escape.
ဒီဝါတွေကိုလောနာကျင်ကြိုက်ခဲကုန်ဒါမဲ့ငါမကြောက်ဘူးငါသတိလစ်မသွားဘူး
It was very painful, but I never once was scared or did I pass out from
အကုန်
fear.
ကိုအဲ့ဒီတော့ဖြစ်တဲ့အကုန်လုံးအသေးစိတ်အကုန်မှတ်ပြီ
I can remember in fine detail what happened, what had took place at that very night.
ငါခြေတော့မှန်ပြီးတော့ဆက်ပြီးတော့လာလျှောက်တာမှာရဲအုပ်စုကြီးမတက်ရနေတဲ့ဒီရောက်သွားတယ်
There was so many police officers there who were trying to break our protest down.
သူတို့ကဒိုင်းတွေတုတ်တွေကင်ထားပြီးတော့တိုက်ဖို့အဆင်သင့်ဖြစ်နေတယ်
They were ready to take force action against us. They had shields, they had riot gear, batons, the full gamut of weapons against unarmed monks.
ငါလက်မြောက်ပြောင်းပြီးကြည့်ကြပါအောင်ကိုကြည့်ကြပါအောင်ကိုပြောလိုက်တယ်
I raised my arms up and I screamed at them, "Look what you've done. Do you see what you've done?"
ငါတကူလုံးမွေးရဆွဲလောင်ထားတယ်ငါနေလေကိုလုံးလောင်ထားတယ်
My entire body was essentially half naked. All the robes and blankets that I had covering just lit up because of the chemical weapons.
ငါကတာမကတ်တယ်ကတ်နေတယ်
The pieces of fabric from my robes were seared right into my skin.
အရေးပြားတွေအကုန်လုံးဘာမှမကြံတော့ဘူး
I had no skin. It was very tender and it was bruised and burnt.
အရေးပြားမရှိလို့
It felt very cold because I felt that I had no protective clothing or barriers. အရှင်ပြနှစ်နှစ်အတွင်းမှာဘာကြောင့်အမှုယူလာလဲဆိုတာပြောလို့ရမှာရှင်ပြဘာလို့ဆိုအချိန်လည်းသိမ့်မရှိတဲ့အတွက်
ပြီးခဲ့တဲ့နှစ်နှစ်ကငါကကျမကြီးရမပြုတ်စတဲ့တန်လည်းမတန်ဘူးတိုင်းတော့ငါစောင့်နေတယ်ငါဘာမှမလုပ်ဘူး
The health impact or the aftermath of this attack was so terrible that it has taken me 2 years. The injuries that I'm living with are the direct results of what happened that night. It took me almost 2 years before I was able to move and be mobile and do things that I was able to do before. They take such extreme actions, the authorities, they think that they're in the right somehow. The oppressors portray those of us wanting democracy and protesting peacefully. They portray us as the wrongdoers who are breaking the law. But in fact, the reality is it is them who are not obeying the law, and it is them who are the wrongdoers. I truly feel that unarmed protesters like myself really don't deserve to be treated this way and to be brutally crushed using chemical weapons. This isn't ordinary weapons. These are weapons that result in tremendous amount of injury. They're chemical weapons. Yeah. အရှင်ပြရင်တမင်းနဲ့ပဲကြံတော့တဲ့အတွက်တပည့်တော်ဟိုအရှင်ပြအမှုနဲ့နှစ်နှစ်အတွင်းမှာဘာဖြစ်လို့ General Coco အေးအေးယူရတယ်ဆိုတာနည်းနည်းလေးတူတူလေးလုံရင်ပြောပါလားအရှင်ပြ
ခုကတို့ကိုနေနေတာမှာဒီတည်းဝကြီးကိုကသူ့နာမည်နဲ့အမိတ်ထုတ်ခဲ့တာဖြစ်တယ်
The crackdown against us protester came at the behest or on the order of the Minister of Home Affairs, General Coco. And the police chief who carried who followed the orders and executed the attack is under the direction of General Coco. In a way, what happened to us and other hundreds of monks that were previously injured are the direct result of these two individuals. That's why I tried to seek justice on behalf of others like myself. I want for there to be justice, and I've tried to hold these two individuals accountable. Because it's a legal case and I'm not trained in the law, I've approached legal groups and have had Yuan Fang, the lawyer, represent me in this matter. I've received support from groups such as Justice Trust to bring this lawsuit forward, working in collaboration with local lawyers. And I'll leave you now so that the lawyer Yuan Fang can explain to you more about the legal case. ကျေးဇူးပဲရှင်ပြရေတပည့်တော်တို့အားဆိုအရှင်ပြကိုလှုပ်လိုက်မယ်အရှင်ပြနဲ့ကိုနေလင်းသူလှုပ်ချင်တာလို့ရတယ်နောက်မှတပည့်တော်ဖုန်းခေါ်မယ်နော်ဟုတ်ကျေးဇူးပဲရှင်
I think we'd like to thank you for joining us, especially when you're not feeling well. We appreciate you doing this.
Tyler နဲ့ဒီအကြောင်းသားတွေကပြောအရှင်ပြနေမကောင်းဖြစ်တာနဲ့ဒီလိုမျိုး Skype ပေါ်ကနေခေါ်ပြီးတော့တပည့်တော်တို့စကားပြောကျေးဇူးအများကြီးတင်တယ်တဲ့အရှင်ပြ
Please join
He said that it's my pleasure. I really do want to talk to you all and be in person, but I can't, and I'm glad that we can do this.
Thank you.
Okay, bye, Shimpia.
Long thing.
Lawyers like myself, as well as working in collaboration with Justice Trust, we were in the area, we had done documentation and had written a report of what happened in Lepidon. And that's how we became introduced to this monk and the struggles that the community there faced.
The chemical Lenego, the Justice Trust and Bureau, Kunibio, Nenganagama, General Letmanibo, Sunan, Portokia, General Lekan Yunjibio. Ali Pibiha, Milan Bongo, Fumsoy General Kayan Mama Yunjilo, Justice Trust and General Lungan statement is over.
So the focus of the report that we worked with Justice Trust on and Justice Trust published was with regards to the contents of that canister in itself. We had community members collect the canister, but it was the organization that took it out of the country and had an international lab analyzed it and has irrefutable proof that it is white phosphorus and it is a chemical weapon prohibited by international conventions.
Hello, this is Pibiago, Miss Wagama, Longere December Loga, Dokken Wins Rosa, no the media. Come with the Nana Pita Camio, a son up dying, and come with the Napita Camio, they soon were Sabio use on
The area of Lebanon is still very much contentious and it's still ongoing as far back as 6 months ago. I mean, what happened to the monks was 2 years ago, but there are still clashes between the civilian population and the authorities. 6 months ago, there was a farmer by the name of Dokyen Wen who was also an unarmed protester that was protesting. And because of what she was doing, she was shot in the head by police. And there was no accountability there either.
Hello, through the movie in Punel of Jore, General Dihaha, Luther Mupede, no, Taume, Luther Mupede, so we general Yesagama, fire open.
We wanted for there to be justice on behalf of the monk as well as Dokyen Wen because for the Dokyen Wen case, because it was so high profile and it was a cold-blooded murder, that's what we're portraying it as lawyers. But for them, they said that it could be an accidental death and they tried to open an inquest into the cause of death. But many of us are pushing domestically to look into criminal responsibility for Dokyen Wen.
Hello, a Dokyen Wen is Omale, General Nezaya Wenjiri Bale, Navio Kayan Yemuri Bale, Navio Mune, Ucho Yemuri Bale, Thurogadi Wambangomni, Begani Biro, Thurushi Chema, Dokyen Wenha, Takaya, the Natimami, Takaya, Jumjilo, Diluwa General. The
culprits or the perpetrators who were directly responsible for what happened to the monks as well as what happened to Dokyen Wen are nearly identical. The responsibility falls on the multinational corporation Wangbao, the Chinese military company, who is influencing and getting the assistance of police authorities to do it. The Minister of Home Affairs, who is directly giving command orders for police to use excessive force against the civilians in the country. So we try to open what is called a first information report in both matters against the people who are senior most and directly responsible for these crimes.
Hello. The
way Myanmar works is that anytime you're trying to hold people in power accountable, they refuse to accept it. So in the case of Dokyen Wen, the police refuse to even look into the matter for criminal responsibility.
Hello, General Justice Trust General through Nina Hui Shio, no Kanago Miso Long, ဒီလိုလက်နက်မျိုးအသုံးမပြုရမှသိပါလဲနဲ့ဒီပြည်ထောင်စုဝန်ကြီးနဲ့ရေချုပ်တို့ကဆောင်ရွက်တယ်ပေါ့အဲ့ဒီတိုင်ရက်ဖွင့်နေမှာကျွန်တော်ရှိတာကိုကြီးကြောင်း
So the first idea of this lawsuit against the Minister of Home Affairs came about in our interactions with the communities, and because I'm on the steering committee of Justice Trust and we work in the Leopardon area and have been since the incident that happened, we've been interacting with the monks who has been asking for justice in their case, and that's where we got the idea that perhaps we should launch a domestic lawsuit against these ministers.
အဲ့တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကဒီပြည်ထောင်စုဝန်ကြီးဟာဒီပြည်ထောင်စုဝန်ကြီးနဲ့ရေချုပ်ဟာကျွန်တော်တို့သမရရဲ့လက်အောက်ခံဖြစ်တယ်လို့ဖွဲ့စည်းပုံရမြင်ရပြီမဲ့တကယ်တမ်းကျတော့ကာကွယ်ရေးဦးစီးချုပ်ရဲ့လက်အောက်ခံဖွဲ့စည်းပဲဖြစ်တယ်
The fact that the Minister of Home Affairs may have the appearance of a civilian government or a transition from military dictatorship to a civilian government, perhaps that's how he's portrayed internationally, but in reality he wields a tremendous amount of power and he's only accountable to the commander-in-chief under the current constitution of Myanmar. And they, the commander-in-chief and the military, are the true wielders of real power there.
အဲ့တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကဒီပြည်ထောင်စုဝန်ကြီးကိုရဲ့ရေချုပ်ဇော်ဝင်းဟာတာဝန်ရှိဆုံးပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ကြီးဖြစ်တယ်ဒီလိုလက်နက်မျိုးဟာရေတပ်ဖွဲ့ဟာ3နှစ်3ခါမရှိဘူးသို့တော်လည်းအခုဟာ chemical weapon မှာ3ဆွဲလာတယ်ဆိုတဲ့ဟာကာကွယ်ရေးဦးစီးချုပ်နဲ့ပြည်ထောင်စုဝန်ကြီးရေချုပ်တို့မှာတာဝန်ရှိဆုံးလို့ကျွန်တော်မြင်ပါတယ်
And I think that link with the military is so clear when you look at even the weapon that was used to crush the protests. It's a military-grade weapon prohibited under the Geneva Convention. Who has the access to the arsenal of that weapon is the military. And even though Minister of Home Affairs directly is overseeing the police, the fact that there's this linkage between the hardline military and the authorities shows that the military is very much in control of Myanmar.
အဲ့တော့အဓိကသက်ဆိုင်တဲ့ပြည်ထောင်စုဝန်ကြီးရဲ့ရေချုပ်ကိုရေချုပ်ပါဝင်ဒီဝန်ပေါင်းမှာတာဝန်ထမ်းဆောင်နေတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ကဒီရဲစခန်းမှာ FIR ဘာဖွင့်တော့ခင်ဝင်ဖွင့်တဲ့ကဲဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်ဘာဖွင့်လဲပေါ့နော်အဲ့ဒီမှုကိုလည်းသူတို့လက်မခံပါဘူး
So for the monks case, we also have to start with, for criminal responsibility or accountability, we have to start with the first information report. We filed that as taking the first step towards the lawsuit. The same procedure as what happened with the villager that was shot.
အဲ့တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကဟုတ်ကဲ့အဲ့တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကဒီအုပ်ချုပ်ရေးအာဏာပိုင်ရဲကနေပေါ့အမှုဖွင့်တာလက်မခံတဲ့အတွက်ကျွန်တော်ဒီကပြန်သွားရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီတရားလွှတ်တော်ချုပ်မှာစာကျွန်တော်အမိန့်နဲ့ written ကျွန်တော်တို့သူတို့အမှုကိုထပ်ပြီးကျွန်တော်တို့ judicial system ရကျွန်တော်ထပ်ပြီးတော့တင်အောင်ပါ
It's also reflective of the system of justice in Myanmar, where if you want to look into accountability on behalf of any government officials or authorities, you must have the permission of the president's office. So even though we filed this first information report, the police have refused to accept it and has already come to the lawyer and the monk saying that we can't look into this matter because you don't have the permission of the president's office. So that's not the end of our legal avenue, however. I intend to petition this through the courts and will appeal it until we reach the Supreme Court of Burma.
အဲ့တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ဗမာပြည်မှာက rules of law ဘယ်လောက်ပြီးချို့တဲ့နေလဲဆိုတာကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ပြည်တွင်းကိုလည်းဖော်ထုတ်သလိုနိုင်ငံတကာကိုလည်းသိအောင်ကျွန်တော်တို့မှာဖော်ထုတ်ရမယ်ဆိုတဲ့တာဝန်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုယ့်ကိုလက်ခံနားလည်ထားတယ်
I think we have a duty to bring this sort of lawsuit forward, to push the boundaries of law, because we want to demonstrate to the international community there is no rule of law under a system like this, and to the people of Burma that law can be used as a tool to advance your rights, to test the cases and challenge them, and not used as a tool simply for oppression.
အဲ့တော့လူခွင့်ရေးချိုးဖောက်မှုတွေကတော့ဗမာပြည်မှာအများကြီးရှိပါတယ်အဓိကအဲချိုးဖောက်မှုတွေကိစ္စဟာကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီနေဆက်ဒီမှာဆိုရင်တမတော်ဘက်ကချိုးဖောက်သလိုမြို့တွေမှာဆိုရင်လည်းကျွန်တော်တို့စစ်ရဲတွေကချိုးဖောက်ပြီးတော့ဆောင်ရွက်နေတာတွေ့ရတဲ့ဒါတွေကိုပုံမှန်နေမြင်သာအောင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကဖော်ထုတ်ကြိုးစားပြီးဆောင်ရွက်တာပါ
And also cases like this, we hope to illuminate just in general the violations that have not only happened in the past but are still ongoing crimes that are still continuing to happen in Burma.
အဲ့တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကဒီနိုင်ငံတကာနဲ့ဆက်သွယ်ထိတွေ့မှုဆိုရင်ဒီလို justice trust ကိုဖွဲ့စည်းနေကျွန်တော်ထိတွေ့ပြီးတော့ဆောင်ရွက်ဖို့လည်းလိုအပ်ပါတယ် ဒါမှလည်းခြေရပြမြကဘာကိုကျွန်တော်သိနိုင်အောင်ဗမာပြည်ရဲ့အခြေကစက်ပြဿနာကိုခေါ်ထုတ်နိုင်မှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
I'm really grateful that I had this opportunity to come on this trip with Justice Trust Organization, as well as those of you who are here, to give us a chance and a platform to discuss this and to amplify and to share these stories. So we hope that international community will watch and apply pressure on what's happening in my country.
အဲ့တော့ဒီအမှုအချင်းချင်းလေးကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ကဒီလိုလာရောက်ပြီးတော့ဒီလိုခင်ဗျားတို့နဲ့တွေ့ဆုံပြီးစကားပြောရှင်းပြခွင့်ရရကြအားလုံးကိုကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်
I really want to thank you all for listening and listening to about our case and what we're trying to do, and we hope that you'll follow it and then help us win.
Thank you, Roger is now going to speak about Justice Trust's work for a few minutes, and then Matt Smith will talk about Fortify's work for about 10 minutes. That will bring us to about 12:50. Maybe one round of questions, and then we know people have to get to class, so you'll still be able to get to class by 1. And we'll take a break. If people want to stay after that, as people flow out, then we can do more questions. So that we'll pass 1 if people are interested. Roger.
Thank you, and it's great to be back here. I went to school here almost 25 years ago. The lesson there is that time flies. Now, so Justice Trust has a Myanmar program, and Yuan Fang is the director of that program. We do 2 things. One are we kind of lead in our own cases, like the case against the Home Minister, and also support lawyers to do other cases. The other aspect is we look at kind of rule of law issues, current issues that are very important to the country, and do research and reports, and that's what I'm going to talk about quickly here. This is available on our website, which is justicetrust.net. It's called Hidden Hands Behind Communal Violence in Myanmar. Now, what it is since we work with a lot of local lawyers, we were hearing stories back a couple of years ago even, that this communal violence that I'm sure you're all familiar with, the kind of Buddhist Muslim violence as it's portrayed in the media, which started in Rakhine State or Arakan and then spread throughout the country, what we heard is actually this is instigated violence. This is government-sponsored, or let's say hidden hand-sponsored, not necessarily the government, and it's not reflective necessarily just of Buddhist Muslim tensions. So we looked into this, did a lot of research in the most recent example, that's July 2014 in Mandalay. And what we saw is that this, what's called the conspiracy theory, is actually accurate to what's really happening in the country. Not the first time for Myanmar. It's a scapegoating of minorities using plainclothes units to commit violence, and essentially trying to divert public attention and international attention from, say, the military wrongdoing that goes on to the Buddhist Muslim tensions. It's a common historical tactic. I'm just going to go over the 5 elements that have happened in all of these cases. First is an allegation of an honor crime, almost always rape, against a Buddhist woman by Muslim men. And it's getting passions out. Honor crimes all over the world are viewed as something that really gets the nationalist religious, anger. This rumor, in the case of Mandalay, was fabricated, but this rumor is spread by a radical Buddhist movement called 969, and there's a famous monk named Wiratu who puts out on his Facebook this allegation of rape. It gets spread all over, and this is an organized intimidation movement, really. The very next day, in Mandalay, a group of 25 to 30 thugs, armed, on motorcycles, shows up and starts creating riots in Muslim neighborhoods. Now, what's different about Mandalay from previous riots that you've read about, Mektila, Lashio, other places, is in those places, because the ground was prepared by these ultra-nationalist groups, you had ordinary people joining the rioters. Very hard to distinguish, and it just looked like, and this is a tactic that happens in other countries too, India and other countries. In Mandalay, there was forewarning, people went on the streets, tried to stop it. There are many reasons, but they didn't involve the local community. So you literally had 25 to 30 armed men going from neighborhood to neighborhood with lots of eyewitnesses, and with a contingent of 200 riot police, watching them, following them, making no arrests. The same riot police who in the case of Lepidong attacked with phosphorus weapons, the same police who in the recent case of students cracked down brutally in front of the cameras. There is no fear of taking excessive action by these police, so clearly there are some orders to do nothing. After the riots are over, people are arrested, which only feeds community mistrust of the legal system because they know that the real people who did it are gone. Now, the last element is what we call the suspicious timing. This always happens. I mean, it's like a faucet that you can turn on and off. It happens at a time when, say, the democracy movement is planning a big event. In the case of Mandalay, there was a signature campaign by the NLD where Aung San Suu Kyi was going to appear in Mandalay as kind of this crowning aspect of this campaign, and 2 days before these riots happened. Final point to make is how effective they are. In the last 2 years, this has become the dominant story, internationally as well as domestically, whereas before it was the opening and the hopeful story. This story has retarded progress towards democracy, has allowed the military and the hardliners to kind of reestablish their presence. And I think their goal is to either delay the elections of 2015, which are very important, or turn it into a referendum on who protects Buddhism, who protects the nation, which is kind of an electoral ploy. Again, as I said, unfortunately, it's working. And so we're here with the monk and with Aung Thein to talk to the US government, talk to the UN. We've been on a lobbying tour to try and get people to recognize this is not just Buddhist-Muslim tensions, which do exist, no doubt about it. But it is a deliberate strategy by hardliners to divert attention from the path to democracy, to retard it, and also to scapegoat a minority that's not well liked throughout the country. So that's the reality. I will close with that.
Thank you, Roger. Very good.
I could just say one last thing, which is we're going to put up, we can take a student intern. We're a bit late, but we're looking for law students to work in our Yangon office this summer. We're going to put something up on your boards for that, and we welcome applications.
Matt, do you want to start with that plea as well?
Yeah, we have a competing plea.
Complimentary. There's room for everyone.
Sure. Okay. Cool. I think I could spend at least 10 minutes thanking a lot of people who are in this room. I won't do that, but Tyler, Matt, Amy, Ken, Benji, people have been very helpful to the establishment, founding of Fortify Rights, but also the work that we're doing, and the clinic students, of course, as well. Our mandate is to investigate and reveal human rights violations. That's the first part. The second part is to provide technical support to human rights defenders and human rights activists that are working for change. Our technical support is customized. It can come in a lot of different forms. Over the last 2 years, we've been doing workshops, trainings, editing and research support for local organizations. We can work as publicists behind the scenes to try to amplify the findings and messages of human rights activists who are working on some of these issues. And in terms of combating impunity, our approach is that, combining the independent documentation and technical support. I'm going to try to discuss in just a few minutes 2 problematic areas that we're working in. There's an ongoing war in northern Myanmar right now. We're working there, so I'll try to discuss that. And then also the situation in Rakhine State, which is quite thorny, and Roger talked a little bit about that, so I'll talk about that as well. But I want to try and share, again, really briefly, how impunity is working in some of these areas and what accountability mechanisms exist or don't exist is usually the case. In Kachin in northern Shan State, conflict reignited in June 2011. At the time, I was working with Human Rights Watch, documenting the wartime abuses that were happening up there. This is a war that's being fought between the Kachin Independence Army and the Myanmar Army, as well as several smaller non-state ethnic armies. The Kachin Independence Army is the second largest army in the country, non-state ethnic army in the country. Just to give you a sense of the backdrop, this is an area that's very rich in natural resources. So we're talking about multi-billion-dollar jade deposits, annually generating multi-billions of dollars. We're talking about the largest hydropower potential in Southeast Asia, so multi-billion-dollar hydropower dams. Other minerals like copper, gold, timber, rare earth metals, these are all located in contested territories. And the reason why I want to mention this is because the conflicts not only in the north of Myanmar but also in the other ethnic states, they're about identity, they're about ethnicity, but they're also about economics. And this economic factor has a lot to do with some of the points that Aung Thein made about who actually has power and the obstacles to accountability. So we're coming up against that. In terms of ongoing wartime abuses, we've documented the widespread and systematic use of torture by the Myanmar authorities. We released this report, which is available on our website in June 2014. It was the 3-year anniversary of the resurgence of conflict in the north. Essentially, we've documented just for this and since, but in this report, 60 instances of torture committed by the Myanmar Army, the Myanmar Police Force, military intelligence. These cases of torture were happening in villages, in combat zones, and in places of detention. And again, this is just from the areas that we were able to access. So it's not exhaustive in any sense. Survivors described very severe forms of beatings and other torture taking place during prolonged interrogation sessions. Typically, the authorities would accuse, in this case, men of having an association or in some cases even just a sympathy with the non-state ethnic army. So we've documented sexual assault, stabbings, beatings, and other forms of torture I won't get into now, but it's all in the report. Only one person that we spoke to had received any semblance of medical care after they had been tortured, which is unfortunate given that there is an international relief effort in the conflict area, which humanitarian space could be increased. Apart from this report in the north, we're also documenting a number of other abuses. Some of that information we've published, some we haven't. Some our colleagues in Kachin State have published or publicized in one way or another. Those abuses include forced labor on the front lines of the war. This includes human shielding. We've documented killings and attacks on civilians and civilian objects, pillaging and destruction of property, the militarization of schools and churches, and in some cases the destruction of churches. The Kachin are predominantly Christian ethnic minority. So with all this going on, I thought it'd be helpful to highlight quickly just one case of one attempt to address just one of these many violations. So there was essentially a failed attempt to engage the Myanmar National Human Rights Commission. And this case also involves the courts. This is a case that involves the killing of a 14-year-old girl named Ja Seng-ing in Pakhat Township. This is one of the jade-rich areas. In fact, the world's largest jade deposits are located in this general vicinity. We believe she was killed by indiscriminate gunfire by the Myanmar Army in September 2012. About a month after her death, her father, a man named Breng Shong, sent a letter to the Myanmar National Human Rights Commission expressing concern. Of course, he's a grieving father. He alleged that the military was responsible for the death of his daughter, and he requested an investigation. Following that, criminal charges were brought against him for making false charges against the army. It appeared as though the Human Rights Commission had simply handed over the complaint that was filed by Breng Shong to the military. And this is problematic for a number of reasons, not least of all his security, but it also ended up forming the basis of the complaint, the basis of the case that the military was pursuing against Breng Shong. So as all this was happening, Fortify Rights was approached. We were approached by a local network of human rights activists that we've been working with for some time who wanted to seek some justice in this case. So we ended up providing technical support. Matt Buer was closely involved in a lot of that work. Essentially, technical support to help them do what they wanted to do, and what they wanted to do was document the facts of this case, and they wanted to seek some sort of justice for the death of Ja Seng-ing. They released a film, they released a report. It was front page news throughout Myanmar. Their film received thousands upon thousands of views in Myanmar. Simultaneously, we conducted our own investigation. Our findings were very similar to what the local human rights network had themselves documented in the case, which was that the military appeared to be responsible for the death of Ja Seng-ing and that the charges against her father were unfounded. So in terms of our advocacy strategy, after the release of the local network's report, we drafted a letter to President Thein Sein. And being a small organization, it was very helpful that the clinic here at Harvard was involved in this letter. This is a letter calling for the charges against Breng Xiong to be dropped. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the clinic here, Physicians for Human Rights, International Commission of Jurists, we all got together. We sent this letter to the president. It was delivered to the authorities with the condition that if there was no action on this case, that the letter would eventually be published. So sure enough, there's no action on the case. The letter is published, and there's a second wave of public attention on this one particular case. Still no action. So next up was in January this year, we arranged for Breng Xiong to meet with someone who can potentially help change the outcome. That was, in this case, that was the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, Yang Hee Lee. So Breng Xiong was able to meet Yang Hee Lee, communicate with her directly about this case. She in turn raised it in her dialogue with the senior government officials, mentioned it in her report, her public report, and in her media commentary. Still no action. So the charges, Breng Xiong at this point had appeared in court more than 45 times. A month after that, on February 13th, Breng Xiong was convicted. Rather than he was facing 2 to 7 years in prison for sending a letter essentially about the death of his daughter. But so when he was convicted, rather than face 2 to 7 years in prison, the presiding judge had decided to let him choose between a $50 fine or 6 months in prison. He of course elected to pay the fine, and today he's free. He's going to be challenging the verdict. So there's a lot about this case that demonstrates the ways in which formal institutions are flawed. I'm going to try and, I just got word that I should keep this brief, so I'll try and zoom through some of this. But we're reasonably confident that if we ignored this case, if the letter was never sent, if the local network never focused on this case, Breng Xiong would probably be in prison now. It's problematic that he was convicted, but we would at least acknowledge that there is some sort of, that it's effective when international and local and other people who can help change the outcome are involved in this. So that's the positive lesson. The negative lesson is that for every Breng Xiong, there are many other people who do not have attention put on their cases, and they don't have any measure of justice, or in some cases they end up in prison. Just before closing, I just want to mention the situation in Rakhine State. There are far less initiatives for accountability happening in Rakhine State. You may be familiar with the plight of the Rohingya. Just briefly going back to 2012, there were a series of clashes between the local Rohingya Muslim population and the Rakhine or Arakanese Buddhist population. Both of these populations have endured abuses for a very long time, which have been very well documented. What happened after that was sort of escalated, targeted attacks against the Rohingya, involving state security forces, in some cases involving people who weren't from villages, but showed up to instigate violence. It didn't take much, unfortunately. So we've documented coordinated, targeted, pre-dawn raids on Muslim villages. Entire villages were razed to the ground. There were massacres that took place. Back in 2012, I documented the existence of several mass graves in Rakhine State of Rohingya. So while most of the international attention has been paid to the violence and to the situation in the internally displaced person camps, which is appropriate because the situation in those camps is awful. The violence was clearly terrible, and there is a risk it could happen again. But while much of the attention has been on that, there are over 1 million other Rohingya in Rakhine State who are living under highly abusive policies. And we've documented that in another report that we put out, Policies of Persecution, which is based on 12 leaked government documents that indicate policies restricting movement, childbirth, other everyday activities like repairing one's home. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll just say, in terms of accountability, the challenges are enormous. In Rakhine State, not one government official, not one soldier, not one police officer has been accountable for human rights violations or any sort of abuses against Rohingya, and the government to this day continues to maintain that they have done no wrongdoing whatsoever. Thank you.
I know people are going to start to stream out for class. We can take questions as you do that. I also want you to join me in thanking Yi for translating. That's probably the hardest thing of the entire hour. So please.
So even private citizens who are standing under international law. So why don't you go international and advocate for the massive violation of citizens at the core, the Supreme Court, or at the General Assembly of the United Nations? I say I would advocate that because in domestic court, you always have what the Chinese and Vietnamese call Phu, being Phu. Phu Mandarin would side with the Phu Mandarin. Xian Mandarin would side with the Xian Mandarin. They never take good care of the people. How about going international?
Okay, one question. Other questions? Maybe you guys can scoot over and then.
Yeah.
Sure.
သူပြောတာအဲ့တော့လေဘာဖြစ်လို့လဲဒီနေ့ကဒီနေ့ကခုံရုံးနေသုံးမယ်ပေါ့နော်ဘာလို့လဲဆိုတော့ဒီဘက်ဆက်ဆွဲလာတယ်ဟိုပါလေဒီနေ့ကခုံရုံးတော့ပါတော့ဆက်ဆွဲလာတယ်ပါပဲဒီနေ့ဒီမှာဆိုရင်တော့ဒီပါဦးချင်တယ်ညောင်းနေကြည့်တော့
I guess there's a follow-up to that. Like, what do you see is sort of the ultimate force that will bring about the system changes? Like, traditionally it's been economic sanctions, but I think people are moving away from that. And what do you as advocates see as a solution to bring the change to the system?
Economic sanction လိုမျိုးဟာတွေထားတယ်ပေါ့နော်ဒါမျိုးတကယ်လို့မြန်မာပြည်တစ်ခုလုံးကိုပြည့်ပြည့်ပြောင်းလဲရမှာဆိုတော့ဒီဘာတွေတူအောင်လုပ်ပြီးမှဖြစ်နိုင်တယ်ပေါ့အဲ့ဒါဒီက question
and carrying also from the first one, but maybe with a little bit more of a focused approach to it, China is in many respects the elephant in the room. In 2007, there was the attempt at the Security Council to get a resolution in place that China, Russia, and South Africa vetoed. A number of other attempts in various forums, General Assembly and Security Council, China's been quite consistently sort of supporting the regime. With some changes taking place right now, such as the sort of escalation with the Kokong incursion, which was, of course, also a big deal in the past when it's happened, influencing sort of China's relationship with the country then, as well as issues in China, both locally in Yunnan, but as well as nationally, what's going on under Xi Jinping's sort of crackdown on corruption. Sort of there's the localized support that officials in Yunnan are having with cross-border, exactly there with some of the illicit trade, jade or teak poaching and so forth. But then there's also sort of on a national level where then the sort of security comes in. So if there's areas where then internationally finding new ways of working with China where they've been in the past resistant to cooperate, and then locally at that Yunnan level as well as possibly in Beijing. So I guess just the same question but focused on China.
influence ပေါ့နော်ဒီပြအရင်က security council မှာ ICC မှာတော့လောက်ထားတယ်သူ ICC ပို့ဖို့ကြိုးစားနေတာပို့ရတယ်ဟို Russia တရုတ်တို့ပဲအဲ့လိုမျိုးဆိုရင်အခုကိုခံတာနဲ့တက်ပြီးတော့ the time that she
We have two more, and then we'll do another round, okay? So, please.
2 weeks ago, I was talking to the Indonesian ambassador to Myanmar, who happens to be a 3-star police general. And he said that he was extremely concerned about radicalization of the Muslims who had been quite moderate. He had detected ISIS recruiting in Indonesia and Bangladesh because of the outrages. And he thought that the current policy of the government had dangers that they did not fully appreciate. And I think it might be helpful to bring the attention of American officials to this aspect, because it would probably have more salience than only a human rights case. You know, sometimes when a problem is insoluble, you have to enlarge it. And I think this is one case where that would be at least an option.
Right? I can sort her some light, right? So you're able, Indonesia ambassador Diana Tiki, who's got your able. Given a chip jam, a Muslim opinion, job, who are other than that on the internet was when I was like in that who Indonesia would do region more, Southeast Asia region more, not much of them, Makano, ISIS got a lot of Kulo, Kula Banga, or Yuan or Join America, or Join a case out on a extremism net. The time your lion, or it will be a huge poor or who look for, or you might be Piana, yapping more PR behind that.
Last one.
Yes, my question is sort of a prologue to the first question, which is if you could please describe the legal basis of the case under Myanmar law.
So, well, they should have a move that the outbreak and the action, ya will not move, kill a pair provision, the outbreak, but not law in that. Monkeys are down, your
Okay. Here we start. Who wants to take the first? There's a lot in there. We can go for another hour on those questions, but let's get to a few of them.
Well, I don't mind answering the question about the international law and domestic law. I was actually part of the Burmese exile movement that tried to get the Security Council referral to the ICC and from the international. One of the biggest barriers for ICC is that, you know, in order to get there, you need to meet the 3 thresholds. First, Burma is not a party to the Rome Statute, so we can't do an International Criminal Court tribunal referral. Second, you can investigate or have the ICC prosecutor, in this case Fatou Bensouda, take it upon herself to launch an investigation, which could sort of circumvent the Rome Statute and put the case of Burma in there. And then the third one is, once again, to have the Security Council refer Burma, because it's not a party to the Rome Statute. So in the past, and I guess to this very day, all those 3 avenues have not been open for the people of Burma. And even the countries who have had cases go there, it's long, it's arduous. In addition, not that it shouldn't be done, but it's just the barriers that remain in place are very strong. With our approach to domestic jurisdiction is, you know, the way the laws are in the US or any developing country with a strong judicial system or even a weak one, but that one that you're trying to strengthen, is that you need strategic litigation and test cases so that you create a culture. And I think Yuan Fang could probably add to this, but what we're trying to do with the lawsuits, such as holding this Minister of Home Affairs accountable, is that it's never been done before. But the fact that it hasn't been done doesn't mean that it's not possible.
Just a second, I mean, as following up question, I'm talking about the people, the victim, having standing with the help of, say, the United States, not asking the government of Burma to be a member of the international court in order to sue themselves.
Right.
I don't mean that. I mean, U.S. on behalf of the Burmese victims to sue. But U.S. is not part of the ICC yet, right?
No, they themselves are.
So maybe England. So that's what I mean. The standing of the people as victims and sue by a member state that are democratic and have sympathy for the Burmese people. You don't count on the Burmese government to take the the case?
No. I mean, in this case, the ideal optimistic solution would be to have the ICC prosecutor or the Security Council refer them rather than a member state, because I think the member state, as much as sympathy there is, and there is a lot of documentation over the how many decades with the UNGA resolution, Security Council. In spite of all that, there's never been an impetus to push that one last leap forward for accountability, which is why we've had to think that in order to strengthen systems and to really apply these international concepts, insight is to use the domestic system.
Let me also point out there's an irony that's happening now because of the political opening. And I should say we were just at the General Assembly meeting with missions and pushing this at the political level. But the irony is that previous to this opening, there was a lot of international attention and interest in the kind of called the international justice model. That's how it was pushed. But now it's extremely difficult politically to get not just the US, but any government to use international mechanisms to apply pressure. The attitude now, which is quite widespread, not only here because this is a success, right, for the Obama administration, but internationally, people really want to give the government a chance. They don't want to use international means to pressure them. And it's something we've just found across the board. We're trying to change that narrative with the argument that, look, things haven't changed very much. But diplomatically, right now, it's quite difficult.
I think even Roger, I think, is tapping into something, but also why this is a really interesting time to be talking about accountability again, because of the waves. So before the elections, the first elections, there was a big pressure around international justice and an international approach because it was the only thing that was there. You couldn't bring a case. You could have tried to bring a case like the one that Aung Thein is leading. You probably would have been in jail for that.
Yes.
But so that international pressure was there. Then there was kind of a honeymoon period after the election. And I think one of the questions, overarching questions and thoughts about having this discussion now is that accountability discussions are coming back. And it may not be to the point where it's an international discussion yet, but there are certainly more accountability discussions on Myanmar than there were 2 years ago. And the question is, will that actually change behavior? There are ongoing issues that need to be dealt with, but that's an overarching issue, and they go in cycles. And I think that the accountability discussion is coming back generally.
The way the legal system inside Burma is structured, or even the attitude that people have towards international law from the authority side, is that that's just out there. Nothing, you can have all the protections and all the rights enshrined in a legal international document out there, but inside. And even there's the concept of domestic exhaustion of remedies. That's something that hasn't really been done because the criminal justice system or the court system being the way they are, but we have to pursue domestic litigation to introduce that culture to the people of Burma themselves, which is a completely foreign concept after decades of dictatorship.
General crimes against humanity so we are they also choose our peer pressure
I mean, the threat of international prosecution and accountability is a very strong motivator for them to change and to allow domestic lawsuits to prosecute. It's always the end goal. A while ago, this was in the 2000s, where there was that looming threat that Than Shwe may be taken to ICC. That really could have fed or could have led to the Constitution and their roadmap to democracy, but that was certainly the current, that was then. And I think the trends that changes and fluctuate, I think it's related to the question regarding China. It's really directly affected by foreign policies as well as bilateral relations as to how a solution may be effective.
Hello. So Naruga, the Kula the Mama, the Bamadi never the years of Wusuni. Kilo Teodu, Nanganiani, wine below the road, Pecha would choose our business, but you're not doing it.
And we've seen from everything that we've crossed, in the international community, there's very strong member states who don't want to see Burma held accountable, who are allies. Those are the ones that are directly standing in the way for there to be international accountability, which is why we're trying to focus inward.
Yoga through a CY0 Obio or accounted polygon, no? So, yeah. Still, so let's see, Anashin, so through another day. The solution through a CY money, Poby County. You got your bar, America, when I'm not through sewing. Kilona legend or Ruria, Tenchum Oma, Pania, Neza, Nangania General.
So for solutions, advancing justice, we have to start inward in the domestic structures. But I can't emphasize how important it is for bilateral pressure in international relations. Policies from China determine how effective something is or whether a country opens up, in the case of Myanmar, whether US and EU have that much sway through bilateral pressure. So all of those will add to whether we can actually achieve justice inside, but it has to start from inside with the assistance of the international community, looking from the outward in, I suppose.
Hello. Nabio mine near Anisa Somali, Teugani, Gina, the Bawata Tuasa, Teugani, Nazo, Siwai Logi, Ubio Lone, Piduri, Pamabia, Piduri, Jogo, the Bams and Lahu, so I choose you to be Senani, don't do ya.
So then, what drives the international relations or what drives the neighboring countries' powerful interests in the land? Unfortunately, it's that resource, even in this open transition, open door, it's just resulted in large amount of countries flocking in to develop, to invest and to grow their economies and to grow their companies. But the negative impact that's felt by the people on the ground is not really taken into account. That's what's so important for us to not rush and develop and ensure that we bring cases for mass violations to be held accountable, because it will only get worse if there's no checks in place.
Hello, General Nangamaga, Longa, Badai, Jigiongi Sari, Chipola, the Bishu. Najim Privakashi, no, Tabime, Jumui, Mundimu, Mishia, totally the Anashin Sua hatred, no, the Mondiari. Badai, Nangai, Uchambia, Amundiari, Badai, Tumchara, Anashin Dongere, Giannini, Anashin Legend, Shudoale, Suale, Elu, Dumjunia, John Duyat.
And when we talk about communal violence and what's happened to one of the big underlining current that's been running through this entire transition is that we have to recognize the powerful interests that are at play. There are hardline militaries. They didn't just disappear overnight. There's a quote-unquote transition where they took off their uniforms and put on civilian clothes. But keeping this communal violence alive destabilizes any sort of meaningful transition that's going to be in play in Burma.
Hello, General, the Shimpia, Mukin Surale. General, Lilo, Pirema, Filipina, Yesamuria, Kuluji, Yahandanga Roma, through messages. A Chabala Diago, the road, Jumi John, Nisabuza, the women who go away, Eugene Diaboma, Nisandachi. Dario General, Buons and Buza, Nanganagani, the Harry Pia people or General.
And we need to recognize the political gains that are had by keeping this country destabilized, using communal violence, which is easy. It's happened before in this country. It's a pattern that's happened again and again. And it's not just look at minority groups that are scapegoated. I mean, look at this monk that you just heard today. He's the leading leader, a monk leader of the Buddhist religion, the same religion that the government is supposedly the protectors of and are prescribing to. Even these people are crushed and oppressed when they speak out. So for them to sacrifice a minority group and demonize them and oppress them to use political gain, it's not a big leap for this brutal military.
အဲ့တော့ဒီအခြားဘာသာကြားတွေကိုနှိပ်ကွပ်တယ်ပြောရတယ်ကိုယ့်ဘာသာကိုလည်းနှိပ်ကွပ်နေတဲ့အာဏာရှင်စနစ်ကဒီနေ့ကျွန်တော်နိုင်ငံမှာရှိနေတယ်ဆိုတာကိုသိစေတယ်
Really, at the end of the day, it's with regards to the dictatorship and the system at play. Everything that happens from the oppressed minorities to the lack of accountability for the monks and the development, it's who's in power and who's still hanging on to that. I know we touched on a few questions in that answer, but I don't know if it was like directly like your question.
I think the one question that's out there that's probably pretty precise.
The legal basis.
The legal basis. Maybe you can take that, and then Matt, you can get a couple comments.
Yeah. So ဦးအောင်သိန်းဖြစ်နိုင်ရဲ့ဟိုဒီလိုနဲ့လို့ရင်แบบဟိုပါလေအမှုဘုံကြီးအမှုကိုဘယ်လိုမျိုးပဲ legal basis ကနေလာမယ်ပေါ့တရားဥပဒေနဲ့
တရားဥပဒေကပြောရင်တော့ဟောပါမယ်ဒီဘုံကြီးမှုဟာခန္ဓာကိုယ်တစ်ခုလုံးဆွဲလောင်မယ်ဆွဲလောင်သွားတယ်ကျွန်တော်ဒီမှာ previous hard with weapons ပေါ့နော်
There's a provision under criminal law about grievous hurt with weapons, and that's the basis that if we were to sue, and once we get through the different loopholes or the barriers they placed before, once we manage to jump that hurdle and in court, that would be the provision that they'll sue.
အဲ့တော့အဲ့ဒီကိစ္စမှာဘယ်သူမှတာဝန်ရှိလဲဆိုတော့ပြစ်မှုကြောင်းရကျွန်တော်ပေါ်ထုတ်လို့ဒီညနာမှုကုစားဖို့အတွက်ကလည်း civil နော်တေမာကြောင်းရကျွန်တော်ညနာမှုပေါ်ထုတ်ခွင့်ရှိတယ်
So that's the charge, and that is in the criminal arena to hold Minister General Koko responsible for grievous harm with use of excessive weapon. And then, but that's not the only arena. There is also a civil, potentially using tort law.
အဲ့ဒီကြတဲ့အခါကျတော့အစိုးရတစ်ခုလုံးမှာတာဝန်ရှိတယ်ပေါ့နော်ဆော်ရကြည့်လို့ရှိရင်သူ့ရဲ့ညနာမှုဘယ်လိုကုစားပေးမလဲနော်နောက်ချက်ဒီလိုဟာမျိုးတွေနောက်အသုံးမပြုဘူးဒီလိုလက်နက်မျိုးတွေကိုလူလူကိုအသုံးမပြုဘူးတိုင်းပြည်တွေမှာအသုံးမပြုဆိုတော့ injection တွေကျွန်တော်တို့ဆောင်ရွက်ပိုင်ခွင့်ဒါကျွန်တော် common law အလာတဲ့ system မှာရှိနေပြီလား
But with civil, it offers different remedies from criminal accountability under a criminal court. With civil, we hope that we can have injunctions directed by, I guess, remedies to pay or to compensate the people who have been gravely injured, the medical assistance that they have not received at all in the 2 years, and the ongoing medical treatment for the class of plaintiffs who have been injured by this. There's a potential for civil suit, and that's one area as well. Also, he thinks that one of the creative use of civil law would be to have a judge-directed injunction to say that this sort of weapon must be prohibited at all costs, to never use it again, and to do some sort of powerful declaratory statement like that would be another potential remedy for the people who were harmed. And that's what they want.
အဲ့တော့ယဟန်တန်ကဘုန်းကြီးယဟန်တန်ကအနေနဲ့ရော်ကြီးရလို့ဆွဲခွင့်မရှိဘူးပေါ့သို့တော်လည်းသူ့ရဲ့တသက်တာမှာစေဝါကုသဖို့နဲ့သူ့ရဲ့ဘဝရှင်သန်ရေးအတွက်ကျမ်းမာရေးအတွက်တော့သူမျက်နှာမှုအတွက်ကိုအစိုးရဖြည့်ရှင်းပေးရမယ်ဆိုတဲ့တာဝန်ကိုကျွန်တော်တောင်းဝင်ရှိပါတယ်
In a way, by having not putting a monetary figure on the compensation, but the fact that if the government is found the elements are proven or on a probability and that they are supposedly responsible, then they, by funding or paying for the medical treatment, would be an admission of guilt, which is something that the communities have asked for. Not once has there been an admission of guilt or wrongdoing in the matter.
So is in this case is there a public prosecutor that has to investigate and bring charges, the criminal charges, or is there some
private sort of criminal cause of action that can be
criminal case မှာ
Right.
ဆိုရင်ဟိုဆိုရရှင်တွေကနေလာပြီးတော့ဟိုအရှင်ပြားတို့တွေအတွက်တာဝန်ဆောင်ပြီးသွားအောင်မလားဘယ်လိုလုပ်ရမှာလဲ
တကယ်တော့criminal case မှာတရားလိုဖြစ်ဆွဲပြီးဆိုရင်ဒီအစိုးရရှင်တွေကတာဝန်ဆောင်ရတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့အစိုးရရှင်တွေကိုမယုံကြည်ဘူးသို့မဟုတ်အစိုးရရှင်တွေကိုအားမရဘူးဆိုရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီအစိုးရရှင်တွေရဲ့လက်အောက်မှာကျွန်တော်တို့အပြင်ရှင်တွေရတယ်ပူးတွဲပြီးတော့လိုက်ပါဆောင်ရွက်ခွင့်ရှိပါတယ်
In cases such as this, yes, the obviously the duty or is the prosecution is led by a government lawyer or prosecutor, but there have been known instances where people have complete lack of faith in the prosecutorial staff. In those cases, there is an option for the private lawyer that works with the community to sit sort of second chair and to help and put forth question that second legal team has the right to question and be involved in the case in and of itself, even though they're not part of the prosecutor's team. So I think that's the capacity that ideally he'd like to be involved in, should they, allow this case to go forward.
Yeah, so I can just touch on a couple of the.
That's great.
I'll keep it real brief. Your question on what will change the system, sanctions in the past, what now? From our perspective, we want to see human rights activists on the ground have the tools that they need to do what they do. We want to see the scaling of documentation of human rights violations, and so we're trying to focus in on that. We don't do like education of the masses, but we do try to sort of target in and support in whatever ways we can the important work of human rights activists taking place. On the China question, we've been doing a lot of work up on the border over the last few years. In terms of there was some discussion this morning about how China most likely wants stability or harmony and won't necessarily get in the way if things start to change. I would say that's accurate for the most part, but if you look at it in a more sort of atomized way, there are some areas actually where Chinese authorities will put their foot down, and it won't be the way that we want them to put their foot down. And one example is like up on the border in Yunnan, there are now over 150,000 displaced, and so we know. We haven't talked much about it publicly, but we know, representatives from Beijing have been involved in the negotiations between the non-state ethnic armies and the government of Myanmar. And in those meetings, they made it very clear that there was to be no international aid workers on the border. And this is the reason why now, as a result, you've got over 150,000 IDPs and effectively refugees on the Yunnan side who are not getting the aid that they need because the authorities have this idea that if international aid workers are accessing the border, there'll somehow be some sort. They view it in terms of the sort of containment strategies that get discussed. So, and then of course with Chinese business interests, all bets are off. And when what we've seen, and it's not just China, there's other countries as well, South Korea. I mean, even American companies, French companies, as Tyler knows very well, have caused problems when it comes to human rights. So I think generally, hopefully China wouldn't get in the way and would cooperate if things start moving in better directions. But on certain issues, I think, unfortunately, we haven't really been seeing positive trends. The question on radicalization of Muslims, we're very concerned about this also. We've interviewed hundreds of directly affected Rohingya witnesses, survivors of abuse over the years. The abuses are so awful, it is surprising that there hasn't been more people taking up arms. One thing I think that's worth mentioning is from the Rohingya perspective, when they look at the political landscape in Myanmar, they see ethnic groups negotiating with the government. Just 2 days ago, you had these images online of hand in hand, representatives, non-state ethnic armies and the government coming to some sort of agreement, however tenuous it is. And from their perspective, what that says to them is, okay, if we want to be at the table, we need to have guns. There's no other way for us to get citizenship. There's not going to be any other way for us to get, our human rights protected. And so people are thinking this way, and it is a concern. The U.S. knows, other governments, they know about the risks already. I think probably the next frontier of violence in Rakhine State is going to be in this in this sort of false context of counterinsurgency, because there's not a sizable armed movement among the Rohingya now at all, but the authorities are already using it to go into villages, to storm homes, lock people up, essentially give people no other option but to flee the country.
I just want to add to that point, because I think that when we were looking at communal violence working in Mandalay, one of the reasons the Mandalay violence was so limited and it was horrible. 2 people still died, a Muslim man and a Buddhist man, but they were the outsiders were so not effective in inciting the grave violences that like it did in Meitila and Lashio, was the fact that there was a community organization in place. It was a multi-faith, multi-religious, different walks of life. People were very connected. The imams and the Buddhist monks were working in conjunction to try and dissuade people from going in and telling, monks as well as young people, young Muslim boys, like it was during Ramadan, like don't go, don't participate. And it's a model, and I think that's sort of the way to fight militarization of oppressed individuals, like communication and working from the grassroots level up. Because I think when you're confounded with this sort of level of oppression, who wouldn't want to stand up for your right and take arms, so to speak? But I think there is also a hope and a potential way that could be controlled by countering and empowering groups that work together, that creates dialogue. And Mandalay Peace Committee, very mindful that this communal violence could be turned back on again in lead up to the election, have not disbanded. They meet regularly, they monitor trigger actions. If there's a Facebook post, because Facebook is the primary means of social media and it's essentially the internet inside Burma. When they see Wirathu or 969 movement starting to gather steam, they just communicate with the community. That's not false. That's not, and then have dialogue. And I think that's a potential solution. But obviously, if it doesn't come from the government level, it stands to be replicated. But the effectiveness of that really is dependent within the space that the government and the authorities in Myanmar have any interest in maintaining peace there. So
I think that's actually a very good note to end on, because it's a hopeful one. It shows that it's going to be a long process, but that there are people working in communities and at the individual level and as individuals, as we've seen with all of you. And so thank you for the great discussion and on the important issues that you've brought to the table today. Thank you.
Thank you for hosting
Thank you.
this event and for everyone to come and participate.
Very good. Thank you.